Margaret wiped the sweat from her forehead as she looked around her small diner. The lunch rush had just ended, and dirty plates covered most of the tables. She had been running Maggie's Kitchen for 15 years, ever since her husband passed away. The little restaurant on Main Street wasn't much to look at, but it was her pride and joy. The bell above the door chimed as a young man in military uniform stepped inside. Margaret barely glanced up from counting the day's receipts. She had seen plenty of soldiers come and go over the years. Most of them were polite enough, but lately she had grown tired of the loud groups that sometimes caused trouble. The soldier stood quietly near the entrance, looking around the cozy restaurant with its checkered tablecloths and faded photographs on the walls. He appeared to be in his early 20s with short brown hair and kind eyes. His uniform was neat and pressed with several ribbons and badges that Margaret didn't recognize. "We're closed," Margaret said without looking up from her paperwork. She didn't mean to sound rude, but she was exhausted. The morning had been particularly busy, and she still had hours of cleaning ahead of her. The young man cleared his throat softly. "Ma'am, I was wondering if I could just get a quick cup of coffee. I've been traveling for hours, and this is the first place I've seen that looks like home." Margaret finally looked up and saw the hopeful expression on his face. Something about his polite manner made her pause, but she shook her head. "I said we're closed. The coffee machine is already cleaned for the day." The soldier's face fell slightly, but he nodded respectfully. "I understand, ma'am. Thank you anyway." He turned toward the door, then stopped. "This is a beautiful place you have here. It reminds me of my grandmother's kitchen back in Ohio." Despite his compliment, Margaret felt annoyed. She had work to do and she didn't have time for small talk. "Look, son, I appreciate the kind words, but I really need you to leave. I have a business to run." The young man's shoulders sagged a little, but he maintained his composure. "Of course, ma'am. I'm sorry to have bothered you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. "If you ever need anything, my name is Private First Class David Chen. My unit is stationed just outside of town." He placed the card gently on the counter near the door and walked out. Margaret watched him through the window as he stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking around as if trying to decide where to go next. She noticed he had a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder and seemed to be walking rather than driving. For a brief moment, Margaret felt a twinge of guilt. The boy had seemed genuinely nice, and all he wanted was a cup of coffee. But she pushed the feeling aside. She had a business to run, and she couldn't make exceptions for everyone who walked through her door. The afternoon passed slowly as Margaret cleaned tables, swept floors, and prepared for the next day. She tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to the young soldier. There had been something different about him, something that reminded her of her own son, who had died in Afghanistan 5 years earlier. As evening approached, Margaret noticed that the card the soldier had left was still sitting on her counter. She picked it up and read his name again, Private First Class David Chen. On the back, he had written a phone number and a simple message. "Thank you for your service to the community." Margaret stared at the card for a long time. She realized that she hadn't even asked what he meant by traveling for hours or where he was trying to go. For all she knew, he could have been lost or in need of real help. The guilt she had pushed aside earlier came flooding back. She thought about her son, Michael, and how many times he must have stopped at small diners and restaurants during his military service. She remembered the letters he used to write, describing the kindness of strangers who had helped him when he was far from home. The thought made her chest tight with emotion. Margaret walked to the window and looked out at the empty street. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. She wondered where the young soldier had ended up and whether he had found what he was looking for. As she locked up the restaurant for the night, Margaret made a decision. Tomorrow she would try to find Private First Class David Chen and apologize for her rudeness. Maybe she could even offer him that cup of coffee he had asked for. It was the least she could do to honor the memory of her son and the sacrifice that all military families made. Little did Margaret know that her encounter with the young soldier would soon change everything about her quiet life on Main Street. The card in her purse would become much more important than she could ever imagine. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the diner earlier than usual. She had barely slept the night before, thinking about the young soldier she had turned away. As she prepared the coffee and started cooking breakfast, she kept glancing at the phone number on David Chen's card. Around 9 o'clock, she finally gathered the courage to call. The phone rang several times before a gruff voice answered. Fort Patterson, Sergeant Williams speaking. Margaret's heart raced. Hello, I'm looking for Private First Class David Chen. This is Margaret Thompson from Maggie's Kitchen in town. Chen? The sergeant's tone became more serious. Ma'am, can I ask what this is regarding? Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. He stopped by my restaurant yesterday and I wasn't very kind to him. I'd like to apologize and invite him for a meal. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Ma'am, I'm afraid Private Chen isn't available right now. He's in the hospital. Margaret's stomach dropped. The hospital? What happened? Is he okay? He collapsed yesterday evening during evening formation. Turns out he hadn't eaten in 2 days. The medics said it was exhaustion and dehydration combined with low blood sugar. He's stable now, but he's pretty weak. The phone nearly slipped from Margaret's trembling hand. 2 days? Why hadn't he eaten in 2 days? Sergeant Williams sighed. Chen's grandmother back in Ohio is dying. He got emergency leave to go see her, but his flight got canceled due to weather. He spent all his money on the original ticket and couldn't afford another one. He was trying to hitchhike to the airport when he stopped at your place yesterday. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. The young man hadn't just wanted coffee. He had been hungry, exhausted, and desperate to see his dying grandmother. And she had turned him away without a second thought. Which hospital is he at? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. St. Mary's General, about 20 minutes from town. But ma'am, visiting hours don't start until— Thank you. Sergeant, Margaret interrupted, already reaching for her purse and keys. The drive to the hospital felt like the longest 20 minutes of Margaret's life. She kept thinking about her own son, and how she would have felt if someone had treated him poorly when he needed help. By the time she reached the hospital, tears were streaming down her cheeks. At the information desk, she asked for David Chen's room number. The elderly volunteer looked at her with curiosity. Are you family, dear? Margaret hesitated. No, but I need to see him. It's important. I'm sorry, but only immediate family members are allowed during morning hours. You'll have to wait until 2 o'clock for general visiting hours. Margaret looked at the clock on the wall. It was only 10:30. She couldn't wait that long. Please, I need to apologize to him. I made a terrible mistake yesterday and now he's here because of me. The volunteer's expression softened. What's your name, dear? Margaret Thompson. I own Maggie's Kitchen on Main Street. Oh, the volunteer's eyes widened. You're Maggie. My daughter Jennifer works at the flower shop next door to your restaurant. She's always talking about your amazing apple pie. Margaret tried to smile despite her distress. That's very kind. But about Private Chen, room 314, the volunteer whispered, leaning forward conspiratorially. But you didn't hear it from me. Margaret took the elevator to the 3rd floor, her heart pounding with each floor they passed. She had no idea what she was going to say to the young man. How do you apologize for potentially contributing to someone's hospitalization? Room 314 was at the end of the hallway. Through the partially open door, Margaret could see David lying in the hospital bed, looking even younger than he had the day before. His face was pale and there was an IV attached to his arm. He appeared to be sleeping. Margaret knocked softly on the door frame. David? His eyes opened slowly and for a moment he looked confused. Then recognition dawned on his face. Mrs. Thompson? From the diner? Yes, Margaret said, stepping into the room. I came to apologize. I heard what happened, and I feel terrible about yesterday. David tried to sit up straighter in the bed. You don't need to apologize, ma'am. You were just running your business. I understand. No, you don't understand, Margaret said, pulling a chair closer to his bed. I found out about your grandmother and why you needed to get to the airport. I should have listened to you. I should have helped you. David's eyes filled with sadness. My grandmother passed away this morning, he said quietly. I didn't make it in time to say goodbye. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob. I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. If I had just given you that cup of coffee, if I had asked what you needed. Mrs. Thompson, please don't blame yourself, David said gently. My grandmother wouldn't want that. She always taught me that everything happens for a reason. Margaret looked up at him through her tears. How can you be so kind to me after what I did? David smiled weakly. Because that's what she would have wanted. She always said that kindness is the most important thing we can give to each other, especially when it's hard to give. At that moment, Margaret realized that this young man possessed a wisdom and grace that she had lost somewhere along the way. She had let her bitterness and exhaustion cloud her judgment, and it had cost him the chance to say goodbye to the person he loved most. "Is there anything I can do?" Margaret asked. "Anything at all?" David thought for a moment. "My unit has been really good to me. They took up a collection to help pay for another flight. Even though it's too late now, maybe you could just thank them for me. They don't know what happened at your restaurant, and I'd rather keep it that way." Margaret nodded, though she knew she would need to do much more than just say thank you. She had a lot of making up to do, not just to David but to herself and to the memory of her son. Margaret left the hospital with a heavy heart but a clear mission. She drove straight back to her diner, but instead of opening for lunch, she flipped the sign to closed and began making phone calls. The first call was to her supplier to order enough food for a large group. The second was to her neighbor, Betty, who had been helping at the diner during busy periods. "Betty, I need your help with something important," Margaret said when her friend answered. "Can you come to the diner today? I'm planning something special." "Of course, dear. What's going on?" Margaret explained the situation with David Chen, though she left out the part about turning him away initially. She simply said she wanted to do something nice for his military unit to show her appreciation. By afternoon, Margaret and Betty were busy preparing a feast. They cooked pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, and Margaret's famous apple pie. The aroma filled the entire diner, attracting curious looks from passers-by who wondered why the restaurant was closed but clearly buzzing with activity. Around 4 o'clock, Margaret called Fort Patterson again. This time, she asked to speak with David's commanding officer. "This is Captain Rodriguez," came a crisp voice over the phone. "Captain, this is Margaret Thompson from Maggie's Kitchen in town. I met one of your soldiers, Private Chen, and I'd like to invite his unit for dinner tonight. Free of charge, of course. It's my way of saying thank you for their service." Captain Rodriguez sounded surprised. "That's very generous, Mrs. Thompson. Chen mentioned meeting someone in town, though he didn't give details. I'm sure the men would appreciate a home-cooked meal. We have about 20 soldiers in Chen's platoon." "Perfect," Margaret said, though her heart skipped a beat at the number. She and Betty had prepared enough food, but she hoped they had made enough. "Would 6 o'clock work?" "We'll be there, ma'am. Thank you for thinking of our soldiers." As Margaret hung up the phone, she realized she was more nervous than she had been in years. Betty noticed her anxiety and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're doing a wonderful thing, Maggie," Betty said. "Your son would be proud." Margaret smiled, but worry gnawed at her stomach. She had never hosted a military unit before, and she wasn't sure what to expect. Would they be formal, loud? Would there be enough food? What if they didn't like her cooking? At 5:30, Margaret and Betty had set up every available table in the diner. They had borrowed chairs from the church next door and even set up a small buffet table near the counter. The food was ready, the tables were set, and everything looked perfect. At exactly 6 o'clock, Margaret heard the rumble of vehicles outside. Through the window, she saw 2 large military trucks pulling up in front of the diner. Her heart began racing as soldiers in uniform started climbing out of the vehicles. Captain Rodriguez was the first to enter, followed by a stream of young men and women in military fatigues. Margaret was struck by how young they all looked. Most of them couldn't have been much older than her son had been. "Mrs. Thompson?" Captain Rodriguez approached her with an extended hand. "I'm Captain Rodriguez. Thank you so much for this invitation. The soldiers are really looking forward to a home-cooked meal." Margaret shook his hand, trying to hide her nervousness. "Please call me Margaret. Everyone, please sit wherever you'd like. The food is ready." As the soldiers found seats around the diner, Margaret noticed they were all very polite and respectful. They spoke in quiet tones and waited patiently as she and Betty began serving the food. One young woman helped carry plates, and several others offered to help in the kitchen. "Ma'am, this smells incredible," said a soldier with sergeant stripes on his sleeve. "We haven't had a meal like this since we left home." Margaret felt her anxiety begin to melt away as she watched the soldiers enjoy the food. They ate with genuine appreciation, complimenting everything from the pot roast to the cornbread. The conversation was lively but respectful, and Margaret found herself laughing at their stories and jokes. About halfway through the meal, Captain Rodriguez stood up and tapped his fork against his glass. "I'd like to say something," he announced, and the room fell quiet. "Mrs. Thompson, what you've done here tonight is extraordinary. It's people like you who remind us why we serve our country. Your kindness means more to these soldiers than you'll ever know." The entire room erupted in applause, and Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. She looked around at all the young faces smiling at her and felt a warmth she hadn't experienced since her son died. "Actually," Margaret said, standing up slowly, "I have something I need to confess." The room grew quiet again, and Margaret's heart began pounding. She hadn't planned to tell them about her encounter with David, but suddenly she felt compelled to be honest. "Private Chen came to my diner yesterday," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "He asked for a cup of coffee, and I turned him away. I was tired and busy, and I didn't take the time to listen to what he really needed." The soldiers looked at each other with confusion, and Captain Rodriguez frowned. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm not sure I understand." Margaret took a deep breath. David was trying to get to the airport to see his dying grandmother. He hadn't eaten in 2 days and was exhausted. All he wanted was a cup of coffee, but I refused to serve him because we were technically closed. The room was completely silent now. Margaret could see the shock and disappointment on some of the soldiers' faces, and she felt her courage faltering. "He collapsed later that night," she continued, tears now streaming down her cheeks. "He's in the hospital, and his grandmother died this morning. He never got to say goodbye, and it's partially my fault." Sergeant Williams, who Margaret recognized as the voice from her phone call, stood up slowly. His face was hard and angry. "Let me get this straight, ma'am. You turned away one of our soldiers when he was in need, and now you're trying to make up for it with a free dinner?" Margaret nodded miserably. "I know it doesn't fix anything. I know I can't undo what I did, but I wanted to show my appreciation for all of you, and to honor David's service." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Several soldiers had stopped eating and were staring at Margaret with expressions ranging from disappointment to anger. Captain Rodriguez looked around the room, then back at Margaret. "I think we need to discuss this situation, Mrs. Thompson, but not here, and not now." Margaret realized that her attempt to make amends had backfired completely. Instead of showing appreciation for the military, she had exposed herself as someone who had failed one of their own in his time of need. The soldiers finished their meal in uncomfortable silence. Margaret watched as they politely thanked her for the food, but she could see the coldness in their eyes. Captain Rodriguez spoke with his men in hushed tones while Margaret and Betty cleaned up the dishes, neither woman speaking. As the last soldier filed out of the diner, Sergeant Williams approached Margaret. His expression was stern, and Margaret braced herself for what he was going to say. "Ma'am, Chen is one of the finest soldiers I've ever served with," he said, his voice low and controlled. "He never complains, always volunteers for extra duty, and would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. The fact that someone in this community treated him poorly when he was at his lowest point, well, it's hard to swallow." Margaret nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I know. I can't forgive myself for it." "The thing is," Sergeant Williams continued, "Chen specifically asked us not to hold any grudges. He said you were just having a bad day and that everyone deserves understanding. That's the kind of person he is." After the soldiers left, Margaret sat alone in her empty diner, surrounded by the lingering smell of the dinner she had prepared. Betty had gone home, sensing that Margaret needed time to process what had happened. The evening had been a complete disaster. Instead of making amends, she had only made things worse. The next morning, Margaret opened the diner as usual, but her heart wasn't in it. She served coffee and breakfast to her regular customers, but she couldn't stop thinking about the disappointed faces of the soldiers from the night before. Around mid-morning, she decided to visit David again, though she wasn't sure what she would say. At the hospital, she found David sitting up in bed, looking much better than he had the day before. He smiled when he saw her, which only made Margaret feel worse about the situation. "How are you feeling?" she asked, settling into the same chair she had occupied yesterday. "Much better, thanks. The doctor says I can probably go back to base tomorrow." David studied her face with concern. "You look upset. Is everything okay?" Margaret told him about the dinner with his unit, and how she had confessed to turning him away. David listened quietly, his expression growing more serious as she spoke. "They're angry with me," she concluded, "and they have every right to be. Your sergeant made it clear that I had disappointed them all." David was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Thompson, I specifically asked them not to judge you for what happened. I told them you were just having a difficult day." But they deserve to know the truth, Margaret said. You're a good person, David, but I'm not going to hide behind your kindness anymore. That afternoon, Margaret returned to find a surprise waiting at her diner. Betty was there, along with 3 other women from the neighborhood. They had bags of groceries and were already busy in the kitchen. What's going on? Margaret asked, confused. We heard about what you're trying to do for that young soldier, said Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop next door. We want to help. Help with what? Betty smiled. We're going to show that boy and his unit what this community is really made of. We're organizing a proper welcome home celebration for when he gets out of the hospital. Margaret felt a mix of gratitude and anxiety. I appreciate the thought, but I think I've done enough damage already. Nonsense, said Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who ran the corner market. One person's mistake doesn't represent all of us. We're going to show these soldiers that our town cares about them. Over the next several hours, Margaret watched in amazement as word spread throughout the small community. The local pastor offered the use of the church hall. The high school marching band volunteered to perform. Local businesses donated food, decorations, and services. Even the mayor got involved, declaring it an official town appreciation event. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, but she also felt a growing sense of dread. What if the soldiers didn't want to come? What if they saw this as another inadequate attempt to make up for her mistake? That evening, Captain Rodriguez called her. Mrs. Thompson, I understand that your community is planning some kind of event for Private Chen and our unit. Yes, sir, Margaret replied nervously. The whole town wants to show their appreciation. But if you think it's inappropriate... Actually, I think it's exactly what we need, Captain Rodriguez interrupted. But I want to make something clear. This isn't just about Chen anymore. Word has gotten out to other units on the base about what happened. There are a lot of soldiers who are curious about this town, and the woman who turned away one of their own then tried to make it right. Margaret's stomach dropped. What do you mean? I mean you might want to prepare for a bigger crowd than you expected. The story has spread, and there are soldiers from multiple units who want to meet you and see what this community celebration is all about. After hanging up the phone, Margaret realized that her simple attempt to apologize to one soldier had snowballed into something much larger than she had ever imagined. The entire base was now aware of her story, and they were all coming to see what kind of person she really was. She looked around her small diner and wondered how her quiet life had suddenly become the center of so much attention. Tomorrow she would face not just David's unit, but potentially hundreds of soldiers who had heard about her mistake and her attempts to make amends. Margaret spent the evening helping with preparations for the community event, but her mind was racing with worry. She had wanted to quietly apologize to one young man, but instead, she had created a situation where her actions would be judged by the entire military community. As she locked up the diner that night, Margaret realized that tomorrow would either be the day she proved herself to be worthy of the community's support, or the day she confirmed that she was exactly the kind of person who would turn away a soldier in need. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than anything she had ever carried, including the grief of losing her son. The day of the community celebration dawned bright and clear, but Margaret woke up with a knot in her stomach. She had barely slept, imagining all the ways the event could go wrong. What if the soldiers came expecting an apology and left feeling more insulted than before? By 8 in the morning, the church hall was buzzing with activity. Volunteers were hanging decorations, setting up tables, and arranging flowers. The high school marching band was practicing in the parking lot, and local restaurants were delivering food donations. Margaret tried to help where she could, but she felt like she was moving through a fog of anxiety. Margaret, you need to eat something, Betty said, pressing a cup of coffee into her hands. You're as pale as a sheet. I can't eat, Margaret replied, watching through the window as more volunteers arrived. Betty, what if I've made everything worse? What if they come here and see all this as some kind of insult? Before Betty could answer, Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop rushed over to them. You need to see this, she said, pointing toward the street. Margaret looked outside and felt her heart skip a beat. Military vehicles were arriving, more than she had ever seen in one place. Trucks, jeeps, and buses were parking along every available space on Main Street. Soldiers in dress uniforms were getting out and forming up in groups, their polished shoes gleaming in the morning sun. How many are there? Margaret whispered. Pastor Williams, who had been helping with the setup, came over to the window. I just talked to the base commander. They're sending representatives from every unit on the base. That's over 300 soldiers. Margaret felt dizzy. 300? The story has spread beyond just the local base, Pastor Williams continued. Apparently, other military installations heard about what happened and what the community is doing in response. Some soldiers drove hours to be here. Through the crowd of uniformed personnel, Margaret spotted Captain Rodriguez helping David Chen out of a military sedan. David was in his dress uniform, though he still looked a bit pale from his hospital stay. Margaret watched as other soldiers approached him, shaking his hand and patting his back. They're treating him like a hero, Betty observed. Maybe because he is one, Margaret said quietly. At 10 o'clock, the formal ceremony began. Margaret stood on the small stage that had been set up in the church hall, looking out at a sea of uniforms. Never in her life had she seen so many military personnel in one place. The hall was packed beyond capacity, with soldiers standing along the walls and spilling out into the adjacent rooms. Mayor Henderson introduced Margaret, and she walked to the microphone with trembling legs. The hall fell completely silent, and Margaret could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. "I know you're all here because of a story," she began, her voice shaking. "A story about a woman who failed to show kindness to a soldier when he needed it most." She paused, looking out at the serious faces staring back at her. Many of these soldiers were young enough to be her children, and she could see her own son reflected in their eyes. 5 years ago, I lost my son in Afghanistan. His name was Michael Thompson, and he was a sergeant in the Army. After he died, I let my grief turn into bitterness. I stopped seeing the humanity in others, especially in young soldiers who reminded me of what I had lost. A murmur went through the crowd, and Margaret saw some expressions soften slightly. When Private Chen came to my diner asking for coffee, I saw him as an inconvenience rather than as someone's child who was far from home and in need of help. I failed him, but more than that, I failed the memory of my own son and the values he died defending. Margaret's voice broke, and she had to pause to compose herself. The hall remained completely silent. I can't undo what I did. I can't give David back the time with his grandmother that my selfishness may have cost him. But I can promise you this. I will never again let my pain blind me to another person's need for compassion. She looked directly at David, who was sitting in the front row. "David, you showed me a grace and forgiveness that I didn't deserve. You protected me from the consequences of my actions even when I didn't protect you from my thoughtlessness. You are the kind of person my son hoped to be, and I am honored to know you." Margaret stepped back from the microphone, not sure what to expect. For a moment the silence stretched on, and she wondered if she had said the right thing. Then slowly, one soldier in the back began to clap. Another joined in, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall was erupting in applause. Margaret looked out at the crowd and saw that many of the soldiers were smiling, some wiping tears from their eyes. David stood up and made his way to the stage. When he reached Margaret, he surprised her by pulling her into a gentle hug. "Thank you," he whispered in her ear. My grandmother would have loved hearing those words. The ceremony continued with speeches from the mayor and the base commander, but Margaret barely heard them. She was too overwhelmed by the response from the soldiers. During the meal that followed, dozens of them approached her to share their own stories about kindness they had received from civilians, or times when they had needed help from strangers. One young woman, a corporal from Nevada, told Margaret about a diner owner in her hometown who had given her free meals when she was a broke college student, considering dropping out to join the military. "She changed my life," the corporal said, "and now by admitting your mistake and trying to make it right, you've shown all of us something important about courage and redemption." An older sergeant from Texas shared how Margaret's story had reminded him of his own mother, who had struggled with bitterness after losing her husband in Vietnam. "It took her years to find her way back to kindness," he said, "but when she did, she became the most generous person I ever knew." "People can change, ma'am. You've proved that." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret realized that something unexpected had happened. Instead of coming to judge her, these soldiers had come to witness and participate in an act of community healing. Her confession had not driven them away. It had drawn them in. The event that she had feared would be her final humiliation had become something else entirely. A celebration of the possibility that people could acknowledge their failures, make amends, and find redemption through the support of their community. In the weeks that followed the celebration, Margaret's life changed in ways she never could have imagined. Word of the event had spread far beyond the local military base, and her small diner became an unexpected destination for soldiers from across the region. Every day brought new faces in uniform, young men and women who had heard the story and wanted to experience the warmth of Maggie's kitchen for themselves. Margaret found herself learning names, hearing stories, and forming connections she never would have thought possible just a month earlier. David Chen had recovered fully from his hospitalization and had become a regular visitor to the diner. He often brought fellow soldiers with him, introducing them to Margaret like she was his own grandmother. The relationship that had begun with rejection and guilt had blossomed into something that resembled family. "You know," David said one afternoon as he sat at the counter nursing his third cup of coffee, "my grandmother always said that sometimes the hardest moments in life are actually gifts in disguise." Margaret looked up from wiping down tables. "How do you figure that?" "Well, if you had given me coffee that first day, I probably would have just thanked you and left. We never would have really talked. I never would have known about your son, and you never would have known about my grandmother." Margaret considered this. "But you still lost the chance to say goodbye to her." David smiled sadly. "Yes, but I gained something else. I gained an understanding of how powerful it can be to admit when you're wrong and to try to make things right. That's not something everyone learns." The transformation wasn't limited to Margaret alone. The entire town had been changed by the event. Local businesses began offering military discounts. The church started holding special services for deployed soldiers' families, and the high school established a pen pal program with overseas units. Mrs. Patterson had started keeping fresh flowers in the diner every day, donated from her shop. "It brightens the whole place up," she told Margaret. "Makes it feel more welcoming." The mayor had declared the third Saturday of every month to be Military Appreciation Day, with events and activities throughout the town. The first official celebration drew soldiers and veterans from 3 states, turning Main Street into a festival of patriotic pride and community spirit. But perhaps the most significant change was in Margaret herself. The bitterness and isolation that had defined her life since Michael's death began to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose and connection. She still grieved for her son, but now his memory inspired her to be better rather than holding her back. One evening, as Margaret was closing the diner, Captain Rodriguez stopped by. He had become a regular customer and something of a friend over the past month. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he said, settling onto a stool at the counter. "Of course. Coffee? Please." He waited while she poured 2 cups and sat down across from him. "The base commander has been following the response to your story. He's impressed with how you've handled everything." Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness. "I hope we haven't caused any problems with all the extra attention." Captain Rodriguez smiled. "Quite the opposite. Morale has improved significantly since the soldiers started coming to town regularly. They feel more connected to the community, more appreciated." He pulled out an official-looking document from his jacket. "The commander would like to present you with something. It's a certificate of appreciation for outstanding support of military personnel. You'd be the first civilian in this region to receive it." Margaret stared at the document, unable to believe what she was seeing. "But I don't deserve this. All I did was make a mistake and then try to fix it." "That's exactly why you deserve it," Captain Rodriguez said. "Anyone can do the right thing when it's easy. It takes real character to admit when you're wrong, and then work to make it right, especially in such a public way." Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From turning away a hungry soldier to being recognized for supporting the military, it seemed almost impossible that so much could change in such a short time. "There's something else," Captain Rodriguez continued. "The commander would like to invite you to visit the base. There are soldiers there who would like to meet you, including some who can't make it to town very often." Visit the base? Margaret had never been on a military installation before. "David has volunteered to give you a tour. He's quite proud of his friendship with you, you know. He talks about you all the time." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I can't believe how kind everyone has been to me, considering how this all started." "That's the thing about military families," Captain Rodriguez said. "We understand that everyone makes mistakes. What matters is how you handle those mistakes afterward." That night, as Margaret walked home from the diner, she passed the small memorial park where a monument honored the town's fallen soldiers. She stopped, as she had every night since the celebration, to look at the names carved in stone. She found Michael's name near the bottom of the list and traced it with her finger. "I think I finally understand what you were trying to tell me in your letters, son," she whispered. About how kindness from strangers could change everything about a difficult day. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves on the nearby trees, and Margaret felt a sense of peace that she hadn't experienced since the day she learned of Michael's death. She realized that in trying to honor David's sacrifice and make amends for her mistake, she had actually found a way to honor Michael's memory as well. The next morning brought another surprise. Margaret arrived at the diner to find a young woman in uniform waiting outside, holding a small suitcase and looking nervous. "Are you Mrs. Thompson?" the woman asked. "Yes, I am. Can I help you?" "I'm Private Lisa Martinez. I'm being deployed overseas next week, and my sergeant told me I had to stop here before I left. He said you give the best advice and the strongest coffee within 100 miles. Margaret smiled and unlocked the door. "Well, come on in then. Let's see what we can do about both of those things." As she started the coffee maker and listened to Lisa's story about leaving behind a worried boyfriend and anxious parents, Margaret realized that her small diner had become something she never expected. A place where soldiers could find understanding, encouragement, and a taste of home before facing the unknown challenges ahead of them. 6 months after the community celebration, Margaret stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting the simple blue dress she had chosen for the day. Today was special. She was finally going to visit the military base, and she wanted to look her best. David had been planning the visit for weeks, coordinating with various units and departments to create what he called the full experience. Margaret was both excited and nervous about seeing where David lived and worked, but mostly she was grateful for how much her life had changed. The diner had become more than just a restaurant. It had evolved into an unofficial community center for military families. Margaret had added a bulletin board where soldiers could post messages for rides, roommates, or just someone to talk to. She kept a basket of phone cards by the register for soldiers who needed to call home but were short on money. And every Friday afternoon, she hosted an informal coffee hour where veterans from town could meet with active duty soldiers to share stories and advice. When David arrived to pick her up that morning, Margaret was surprised to see he wasn't alone. Captain Rodriguez and Sergeant Williams were with him, all 3 men in their dress uniforms. "We wanted to make this official," David explained as he held the passenger door open for her. "Today you're getting the full VIP treatment." The drive to Fort Patterson took about 30 minutes, and Margaret spent most of the time listening to the soldiers' easy conversation about training exercises, upcoming deployments, and weekend plans. She was struck by how normal they seemed, just young people trying to balance work and life like everyone else. At the base entrance, the guard recognized Captain Rodriguez and waved them through after checking Margaret's identification. As they drove through the facility, Margaret was amazed by the size and organization of everything. There were dozens of buildings, training areas, and what looked like small neighborhoods of family housing. "This place is like a small city," Margaret observed. "About 5,000 people work or live here," Sergeant Williams explained. "It's one of the larger installations in the region." Their first stop was the mess hall, where Margaret was introduced to the head cook, a burly man named Sergeant First Class Johnson who had heard about her famous apple pie. "I've been trying to recreate your recipe based on what the soldiers tell me," he said with a grin, "but apparently I'm missing something crucial." Margaret laughed. "I'd be happy to show you sometime. Maybe we could arrange a cooking exchange. You teach me some of your techniques, and I'll share some of mine." From there, they visited the medical facility where David had been treated, the training areas where new recruits learned their skills, and the family support center, where spouses and children of deployed soldiers could find help and community. At each stop, Margaret met soldiers who had heard her story and wanted to thank her for creating a welcoming place in town. Some shared their own stories of times when civilians had shown them kindness during difficult moments. Others talked about how the monthly appreciation events had helped them feel more connected to the local community. The highlight of the visit came when Captain Rodriguez led them to a conference room where about 50 soldiers had gathered. Margaret was surprised to see several faces she recognized from the diner, but many were new to her. "Mrs. Thompson," Captain Rodriguez announced, "I'd like you to meet some people who have been inspired by your story." One by one, Soldiers stood to share how Margaret's example of admitting mistakes and working to make amends had influenced their own lives. A young corporal talked about apologizing to his estranged father after years of stubborn silence. A sergeant described how she had finally acknowledged and addressed her problems with anger management. An older warrant officer shared how he had started volunteering with at-risk youth in his hometown, motivated by the example of redemption he had witnessed. "Your story showed us that it's never too late to change," one soldier said, "and that admitting you're wrong doesn't make you weak, it makes you stronger." Margaret was overwhelmed by the response. She had thought her mistake and subsequent attempts to make amends were just about her relationship with David and his unit. She never realized that the story would spread and inspire so many others to examine their own lives and relationships. When the meeting ended, David asked Margaret to walk with him to one final location. They made their way to a quiet garden area behind the base chapel, where a small memorial honored soldiers who had died in service. "I wanted to show you this," David said, leading her to a bench facing the memorial. "This is where I come when I miss my grandmother or when I need to think about important things." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching other soldiers and family members visit the memorial. Margaret thought about Michael and wondered if there was a similar peaceful place at his base where people remembered him. "David," she said finally, "I want you to know that meeting you changed my life completely. Not just because of what happened at the diner, but because of who you are as a person. You showed me that it's possible to face hurt and disappointment with grace and forgiveness." David smiled. "My grandmother used to say that we meet certain people at exactly the right time in our lives, even if it doesn't seem right at first. I think she would have liked you very much, Mrs. Thompson." As they prepared to leave the base, Captain Rodriguez handed Margaret a large envelope. "This is for you," he said. "It's letters from soldiers and their families, thanking you for what you've done for the military community. Some are from people you've met, but many are from soldiers stationed all over the world who heard your story and wanted to share how it affected them." That evening, back in her apartment above the diner, Margaret spread the letters across her kitchen table and began reading. There were dozens of them, from places like Germany, Japan, Afghanistan, and ships in the middle of the ocean. Each one told a story of how her example had inspired someone to be more honest, more forgiving, or more willing to admit their mistakes and work toward redemption. One letter, from a soldier deployed in Eastern Europe, particularly moved her. "Dear Mrs. Thompson, I heard about you from my buddy who was stationed near your town. Your story came at exactly the right time for me. I had been carrying guilt about harsh words I said to my mother before deploying. Your example gave me the courage to call her and apologize. We talked for 2 hours and cried together. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to make things right with the people we love." Margaret carefully folded each letter and placed them in a special box she had bought just for this purpose. She realized that her simple act of turning away a hungry soldier had somehow created a ripple effect of healing and reconciliation that stretched far beyond anything she could have imagined. Before going to bed, Margaret walked downstairs to the diner and stood in the spot where David had first asked for coffee. The space looked different now, warmer, more welcoming, filled with photos of soldiers she had met and mementos they had given her. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, bitter, isolated, letting grief consume her capacity for compassion. Then she thought about the woman she was becoming, open, connected to her community, finding ways to honor her son's memory through service to others. Margaret turned off the lights and headed upstairs, already planning the menu for tomorrow. She had heard that a new group of soldiers was arriving at the base next week, and she wanted to make sure Maggie's kitchen was ready to welcome them with the warmth and kindness that every person, especially those far from home, deserved to receive. The story that had begun with a moment of thoughtless rejection had become a testament to the power of admitting mistakes, seeking forgiveness, and allowing community support to transform individual failing into collective healing. And in a small diner on Main Street, the aroma of fresh coffee and homemade pie continued to remind everyone who entered that second chances and genuine kindness could change everything.